Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Historical Biography. And today we're going to be tackling, not physically, but through this video, Martin Luther King Jr., who is the nonviolent leader of the Civil Rights Movement. He obviously has a big role that he played in American history. And this video is going to be longer than some of the other ones I have put out. I wanted to be as comprehensive as possible. So let's get started. So Martin Luther King was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929, and he was the second of three children, and he was the descendant of sharecroppers. For those of you who don't know, sharecroppers are African Americans who were freed from slavery, but then kind of forced into an unsavory economic situation by the people who were in charge. They were basically slaves, but not in name. King's father was a pastor in Atlanta, and he witnessed the rise of Nazism in Berlin while he was attending a conference. They had like a conference for all the pastors, and he was in Berlin when that happened. His name was changed to Martin Luther King Jr. after this trip, and then it was officially changed in 1957. So he wasn't born Martin Luther King. He was his name was changed later by his father after this trip to Germany. And from early on, Martin learned from his father the system of Jim Crow was wrong and something to resist. So his dad also, in much smaller ways, resisted the Jim Crow laws in the American South. King went to Morehouse College in 1944, and he made it at the age of 15. It was during World War II, and because there were so few people enrolled due to the war, they allowed high schoolers to join Morehouse College as long as they were able to pass the school's entrance exam, which King did. So he was able to start college at 15. Before he headed to school, he visited the North, and he learned about the differences between the two parts of the country and how he was able to do more things in the North than he was able to do in the South. And then at age 19, he graduated from Morehouse with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology, and then decided to join the Baptist ministry. After Morehouse, he enrolled at a theological seminary in Pennsylvania, and he received a divinity degree in 1951. And then right after finishing that, he enrolled at Boston University and received his PhD in theology in 1955, and then accepted a pastor position in Alabama. Now, what he's better known for, though, is his civil rights work, and Dr. King led many civil rights protests in the Jim Crow South. He preached the use of nonviolent protests to help stop discriminatory laws and regimes, and his protests were followed by the national media and was able to expose the open bigotry of the South to the rest of the country and around the world. People at that time kind of knew that there were things that you weren't allowed to do in the South, and that the Southerners were, didn't really like African American people, but the video and the pictures of the violent handling of these protests really put pressure on Southern leaders to stop. It exposed to all these people who are kind of blissfully ignorant all of the violence and extreme racism that was happening not that far away from where they lived. So let's talk specifically about some of his protests, some of the major ones, and how they turned out. His first major civil rights kind of national media one was the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. King led this boycott through with several other people helping him, and it was spurred by the arrest of Rosa Parks because she didn't give up her bus seat for a white person. Now, earlier in 1955, there was another much younger person who was arrested for the same thing, but they decided not to do the boycott with her because she was a minor and a few other things. And so they waited for another opportunity. And when Rosa Parks was arrested, that was when they decided to act. The boycott of the buses lasted over a year. And during that time, King's home was bombed by, as you can probably assume, several very angry white people. And King was arrested during the boycott, which drew national media attention, which kind of grew his stature within the country because people were starting to hear about what he was doing. Here are some pictures. There's Rosa Parks with Dr. King. There's Dr. King not riding the bus. There's Rosa on the bus, and these are all of the people of Montgomery walking to work instead of taking the bus. So then soon after, about 1957, so about 2 years later, King, along with Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and Joseph Lowery, founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which became kind of the base of King's operations for the rest of his life. The group was created to harness kind of the moral authority and organizing power of these churches throughout the South to conduct these protests and campaign for civil rights reforms. They kind of realized that they had a special position as church leaders to lead this change, lead this movement. And Dr. King led the SCLC until he died. So it was a major force in this push for rights. The SCLC is still around. It still exists. They still do things. So it's still an organization that exists. Here are some pictures of the SCLC, some of their members. So the next big kind of thing that Dr. King did were the Atlanta sit-ins. So in 1959, King returned to Atlanta, and he was immediately placed under surveillance by the Atlanta city government. They had police officers tailing him. They were tapping his phones. They were doing all sorts of stuff to make sure that he didn't do anything they wanted him to do. The mayor said a lot of awful things about him. Bad stuff happened. Anyway, King participated in a sit-in at Rich's, which was this huge department store. Imagine like Sears or Macy's in Chicago. It was basically like the same thing, but in Atlanta. And he was arrested, and he was given a super harsh sentence of 4 months of hard labor. And many feared that he was going to get to prison and they were going to kill him. Accidentally, quotes. His harsh treatment drew national criticism, and then the Kennedys helped get him released 2 days later. So they intervened and got him released from prison. Here are some pictures of the sit-ins. So they go and they'd sit in at different places where they weren't supposed to be, and would then get arrested. Then in the 60s, one of the bigger ones that he was a part of, the Birmingham campaign. So the SCLC and the Black community of Birmingham began a campaign against the racial segregation in the city in April. And the campaign involved nonviolent but purposefully confrontational tactics, with the goal to kind of provoke mass arrests and create a crisis-packed situation that would open the door to negotiations, which was kind of the SCLC's big thing. They wanted to create opportunities to negotiate because the situation necessitated it, and that would get them things that they needed. They would get concessions. They would get more rights. They would get legal standing. The sheriff in Birmingham, however, his name was Bull Connor, and he was a very nasty man. And he used high-pressure fire hoses, the ones that they used to put out big fires, to shut down protesters. And, of course, King was arrested. In jail, he did pen his letter from Birmingham jail, which was a big call for others to take action. Here are some pictures from things happening in Birmingham. As you can see, they are being sprayed by these fire hoses. They also had attack dogs out attacking people just protesting. Then in 1963, there was also the March on Washington, which happened just a few months after everything that happened in Birmingham. And so the SCLC teamed up with 5 other major civil rights organizations, and they marched to Washington. And it was officially titled the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And the march had several demands behind it, right? They made demands for prohibiting racial discrimination in employment, protections for protesters, a $2 minimum wage, which at the time would have been a lot, and then self-government for D.C. I looked it up. The $2 minimum wage would have been $19 in today's money. So that would have been a very strong minimum wage if it had passed. And so there's a lot of different things that they were making demands for, and more than 250,000 people of diverse ethnicities attended this event in D.C. They were in the National Mall. And here are some pictures. Here there's Dr. King addressing the crowd. Here's a picture of all the people around the reflection pool and at the walk, and this is them marching to get there. 2 years later, the SCLC teamed up with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is basically like a student-run version that wasn't necessarily religiously affiliated throughout the South. So they were basically like a college/high school club for people who were following King's lead. And they wanted to help register voters in Selma. So they were trying to make a big push for voting rights in the South. Protesters marched from Selma to Montgomery, and they were brutally attacked by private citizens and the state police. And that the day that happened has become known as Bloody Sunday. Footage of the police brutality in Selma made national news and caused extensive public outrage at the blatant racism seen in Alabama. So the people who were doing these awful things, their faces, their actions were being shown to a broader audience of people who didn't necessarily care for it. And that was making a big change. So here, once again, some things that were happening, right? There they are walking on the bridge. This bridge has been, I believe it's being renamed after John Lewis, who died last year. He was actually there. I'm pretty sure that's him right there. That's John Lewis in the front. The police were beating people. Other people from around were beating people. Clearly, it was not a great day. Martin Luther King was also well known for his speeches and writings. He was a great orator, and he spoke very well, which I think is why being a minister or a pastor was his calling, right? He was very good at motivating and getting to people through his own words. So here's a few of the major ones that he talked about that he was kind of responsible for. The first one already mentioned was a letter from Birmingham jail. And this was a letter from that he wrote to people kind of trying to argue against these other pastors who said what he was doing was wrong. He shouldn't be out in the streets trying to make change. He should be litigating in courtrooms. And he argued that his public actions, like sit-ins and marches, created constructive tension to compel meaningful negotiations with the white power structure in the South. And as you could see after the protests over the last 2 or 3 years, because of Ferguson and all these other police brutality deaths, same thing. They're trying to create constructive tension to compel a meaningful negotiation with still the white power structure, not just in the South, but in the United States. And using scripture and the words of like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, Dr. King argued that unjust laws needed to be disobeyed, and it was patriotic to do so. So he was using scripture to say that what he was doing was right. Here are some excerpts from the letter. So I'll read a few of them here. You can say, "You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You're quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the Nonviolent Register may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. And how does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law of the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with this moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in internal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just, and any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality." So as you can see here, these are some examples of the things I talked about before. Another big speech, the one that he's most famous for, is the "I Have a Dream" speech. And this is the one he gave at the March on Washington. It was a 17-minute long speech that deviated from his planned notes. So he was planning on saying something else, but someone who was there with him convinced him to do this speech instead. He talked about how his wish was that all people in the United States would one day be judged by their character and not by the color of their skin. And this speech ended up helping facilitate the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Here's a short excerpt from Dr. King's speech. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So as you can see here, he was kind of appealing to the idea that we all in America have a dream, and his dream is about racial equality. Dr. King also did other activism work. He wasn't just a civil rights leader, he also advocated for other things as well. One of those things was about not getting involved in the Vietnam War. He often expressed his distaste for his American involvement in Vietnam, and he opposed the war because the money that they were using to fight in this other country could be used back home for social justice programs, but instead it was being sent on the military. White allies like President Johnston, Billy Graham, and white union leaders stopped supporting King as much after Republican came out against the war, kind of showing that they were only really helping him because they thought that he was the better opportunity out of other ones. But then once he came out against something they were for, they stopped supporting him as much. Dr. King also advocated for many social programs in the United States that would benefit all Americans. King thought that the system created poverty and that the government had a responsibility to aid people facing economic hardship. And he said that racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism were societal flaws, and argued that reconstruction of society itself was the real issue to be faced. So instead of saying that the people who were poor because they were bad, he was saying that society had made these things acceptable and that they should be changed, which is something that Americans still are grappling with today. Now, unfortunately, Dr. King did not die of natural causes. As you know, he was assassinated. And that happened in 1968. He traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to support a black union in their strikes and their attempts to gain more rights. And after returning to his hotel, he was shot fatally by James Earl Ray while standing on his balcony. After emergency surgery, King died an hour later. There are a lot of different people who say that there was more than one person who was trying to assassinate King, which is totally possible. There was a lot of people who say James Earl Ray was paid by the FBI to shoot King. These are all unsubstantiated. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about this day in particular. But until we have unrefutable proof, we're going to leave those to the side and just say that this one man decided he was going to do this. Afterwards, right, there was a nationwide wave of race riots. Black people were upset, they were angry, and they were scared, and they took it out on infrastructure in the cities, much like what happened in Minnesota and elsewhere over the last few summers, right? When people feel like they have no other outlet, no other opportunity to be heard, rioting is what occurs. Criticism of King's ideas and plans were subdued after his death. They stopped openly criticizing him, at least in the media, the people who were supposedly on his side. And his funeral was attended by Vice President Hubert Humphrey. President Johnson decided not to go because he thought that could potentially make it worse by showing up. And so Vice President Humphrey went instead. His legacy, however, even though his life was cut so short, was pretty staggering. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was spurred by his assassination. And when he died, they rushed to get this passed. It had lots of different things in it. For instance, the first group here of parts was about hate crime laws, and it outlined federal hate crimes and their punishment. The next several groups of things that were in the bill were about the Native Americans, and that ensured that most of the Bill of Rights applied to the tribes, which had not been guaranteed before. There was another big section of it about fair housing, which prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, or national origin. So there was a way to help people who were trying to get homes. And then the last part, which didn't end up probably working the way that it was intended, or maybe it did work the way it was intended, right? The last part was an anti-riot act, making it a felony to travel across state lines to incite a riot. I have a feeling that this provision of this law was used more against black people trying to protest than it was against white people trying to do things, right? So this part here kind of undermines the other larger parts of the bill. But, remember those riots were happening while this bill was getting passed, and so it kind of makes sense why this is being added in here, but I think there's also some ulterior motives as to why the anti-riot part was made in the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Also, beginning in 1971, which was about 3 years later, cities and states started establishing holidays honoring King. And then in 1983, President Reagan declared Martin Luther King Day a federally recognized holiday, and had gained enough support to become a federal holiday. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is celebrated on the third Monday of January each year. And for the first time, it was celebrated in all 50 states in 2000. So even though it was made a federal holiday in 1983, there were still 17 years where certain states, certain areas of the country would not celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. So as you can see, right, there was still a lot of Martin Luther King was not beloved in his time and day when he was around. And even now, there are people who don't like him because of what he stood for. So that's something to think about. It's not all rosy when it comes to MLK Day. There are a lot of people who support in word, but not in action. And then finally, Dr. King was also canonized by the Holy Christian Orthodox Church in 2016, which is pretty cool. Having been a pastor, right, being canonized puts you in some pretty important company. And so he was canonized for his work by a church, which is pretty cool. Way to go, Dr. K. Thank you so much for watching. And once again, please feel free to subscribe to my channel. If you comment on videos, suggestions or ideas, things you want to learn about, I will 100% look into it. I want to be able to make content that you guys want, and I can't do that without help. So if you, ring the bell, subscribe, all of that, I can make more stuff for you guys. Thank you so much for watching and learning about Dr. King, and we'll see you next time. Bye.